Dr. Norrholm, before we get to the cult stuff, I've read over the years a lot of theories about how these authoritarian and sociopathic tendencies arise in people. And there, one particular book that struck me was years ago was it was called The Magical Child. And the theory that was put forward by the psychiatrist, and I'm blanking on his name right now, I'm sorry. I actually wrote the foreword for the book. It was that when fetuses are in utero, they're basically constantly interrogating mom. Is the world I'm going to be born into a safe world or an unsafe world? And mom is communicating that to them principally through the hormone cortisol. And that when mom is experiencing a lot of stress, cortisol levels go up, and that causes hindbrain, fight or flight behavior to be physically, enhanced in the brain, and reduces the development of forebrain, cognitive thought, empathy, whatnot, behavior. Whereas when mom says, no, everything's good, you're going to be safe, it's the opposite. That book was written 20 years ago. Is that science solid, and what does that tell us about living through stressful times and the impact that they have on society as a whole? Do we find, for example, that after wars there's a measurable difference in the percentages of these kinds of people in society?
That's a great question. It's something we tackle every day, and that's the idea of what underlies things like susceptibility to major depression, susceptibility to substance use, susceptibility to the after effects of trauma. And what we know as a field is that it is an interaction between your genes and your environment. So we know, for example, with anxiety disorders, that there's a genetic component to that, so that if you have anxious parents who are by trait anxious, meaning they show an excessive degree of worry, they're concerned about different aspects of their life to the level where it's impairing or distressing to them, there's a high likelihood that their offspring are going to be anxious as well. So we know there's a genetic component to it. With some mental disorders, we know the genetic component is stronger, like schizophrenia has a much higher genetic risk than some of the other disorders we've been talking about. And then the other aspect is in the environment. And so that is how you're raised, how you're brought up. So it may be that you are genetically vulnerable based on your parents' biology to be a more anxious person. But it may also be that you're raised in an environment where your parents were excessively vigilant and especially concerned about safety. And they displayed that in their behaviors to you, and they taught that to you as a way of approaching life. So there it really becomes part of the schema by which people interact with the world. And so what can happen is you may have somebody that's genetically vulnerable to be an anxious person or a worrier, but they're in a very strong moral supporting environment. They've got social networks. They've got a strong familial bond with their parents and their siblings and other relatives, so that even though they're genetically predisposed to be more anxious, they're buffered by the environment they live in, so you may not see that over level of anxiety.
I get it.
And that gets back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is if you have people that gravitate towards authoritarian leaders, for example, that is more geared towards environmental influences and less so on genetic
Totally
influence.
understand. The guy who wrote the book, by the way, is Joseph Chilton Pierce. We'll be right back.